today on stage.
I'm Akshat, and I'll start with a brief introduction of my firm. We started a studio reluctantly in 2007 and called it Architecture Discipline because I felt that was a name that was appropriate to the state of architecture and design in the country at that moment. And we decided that the studio should be a multidisciplinary one. And in those days, again, multidisciplinary was not often used term. So the studio specs its its typhoon theme to master plan, architecture, interior design, and a little bit of product design. And what we do is we borrow from each one of these disciplines to actually to attempt to supercharge whatever project we're doing. I think what's unique about the studio is that we collectively own our projects with our clients. And while that's an often used term, I think there is a different level of involvement, and it's something that we don't really talk about in our work, is how much site involvement and construction control we actually have. And it's a kind of evolution, right? Because you need to go through that story, often as a practice in a cycle, and then to smaller cyclic events, which is film exploration, form exploration, and so on and so forth. And when you go through this, and you've gone through a journey as a collective studio, and you've gone through a journey in life, as an individual, you change, you evolve, time changes you, your experiences change you. And, incidents in your life change. So, in my particular narrative started in 93, when it so happened that I picked up a guitar because I wanted to play progressive metal music. And around the same time, I promised my parents that I would become an architect. It just seemed to be a noble profession. Now, this was by an uncle of mine. And that started, right? And architecture school actually led me to dabbling with photography. Photography gave me a different perspective. Understand the metal and performing, technical music and such. Provided me a push to approaching everything with a certain amount of intensity and looking at things for a certain kind of, control of artistic expression and a sense of deconstruction. And photography actually started to make me look deeper into things that other people had done or that nature had created. And somewhere down the line, I walked into a library and I realized that there were buildings that existed in the world that I had never seen and never imagined. This is a picture of the one building that actually changed my life and the trajectory of my architectural exploration in 1998. And that's a project by a firm called Kuppimmelblau. There was a small rooftop extension in Vienna, and it was so popular at the time that there was a model of it in the Architecture Association. Everybody in Europe was talking about it. And it took me all of 20 years to actually get to that building and realize it was a tiny 1,000 square foot extension, maybe just a little larger than this hall that we're sitting in right now. And, that and the need to see more such architecture led me to London, where I decided to study and work for a few years. I was fortunate. I was chosen as an exchange student. That led me to start looking at British high-tech architecture, the works of Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers, Norman Foster, and the other guys who were working there. And you realize that what I realized was that cities are actually layered. And cities are layered with a certain kind of history. There's no one architecture or one expression that determines what the future of a space should be. So there have to be multiple expressions in multiple layers. You also realize that within studios that are really good, they have different diverse expressions within themselves. You see one kind of language pushed out, but that doesn't mean that's the only language the studio is pushing out. So around 2017, that's 20 years into the practice, 10 years into the practice, we actually had a young artist come in and work with us. He was not a trained artist, he was not trained in architecture, but what we gave him were a series of technical drawings, never gave him access to our photographs of our buildings, never told him anything about projects, but we asked him to actually see what he could do to distill a diagram or a series of new diagrams out of our old projects. And this was really just to sort of bring a new energy into our work. You must realize you work with the same people day in and day out. You spend more time with them than you spend with your family. And it does that you do sort of fall into positive and negative patterns. And you have to keep doing things within the studio to break those patterns. And yet you have to hold, the basics of your studio forward. Don't forget that if you are developing a studio or an architectural language on basis of certain principles, you have to find an anchor. And that anchor is really where you start. The anchor are your influences to begin with. And your influence base and your reference base has to keep expanding. So with this young artist, the first step became to lift the layers of meaning from our technical drawing. And it's actually not an exercise that's traditional. It's an exercise that was coined by an architectural linguist named Jacques Derrida, who coined the theory of deconstruction, who wrote about the theory of deconstruction in the 70s. And people like John Novell, etc., would refer his work, would refer his writing in the architectural work that they were doing. So one of the first things that Harsh got was, drawings such as this. These are technical drawings from our first ever project, which was a large hotel on a reclaimed riverbed in Rajasthan. And I think, as I think about these drawings every time, I look at them and I say, was I really allowed to construct like this when I was 30 years old, when I had very little experience? How was I permitted to do this? And I realized a lot of that permission actually came through the intensity that we put into our work, the intensity with which I would talk to people, the commitment that we had shown to our work, and the commitment that the studio in itself had shown to excellence. Now remember, these were very large projects done by 3, 4, 5, 6 people studios at best at the time. So what I did was we went from these diagrams to actually start pulling out vector graphics like so. And remember, all this while we're actually just looking at things to understand what the abstraction of the building is. We have no idea that this would actually lead us to a book at the end. We didn't even know we were doing. We were actually just trying to have fun while the rest of the students actually really busy engaged with other kinds of work. And through conversations, we realized that we started realizing the meaning in our work again. And we realized one of the first things that architecture has to promise is a brighter future. And that's the reason we have to make buildings in the present that are aligned for what future practices have to do. It's not just for yourself, but it's for everyone else. And that leaves to open to interpretation. So the book is actually just a series of posters or you could say liners where we say cut it, tear it, post it, burn it, do whatever you want as long as it leaves a mark or an impression on you, we're happy. And it's sort of categorized as we start categorizing our practice and sort of start and we start trying to organize ourselves in our own way. We realize that architecture is public art. And we've been fortunate enough to do a town hall again in our or as little as 30 years of age to do a project which is called the Discovery Center and it's in Bangalore. That's actually the assemblage of parts. What we realized from here was that you can actually start piecing the architectural objects together. You layer them. You layer a building and you assemble a series of constructions like you do assemble, a Meccano or a Lego set, so to speak. But you have to create something that goes in distinctive. And the Discovery Center then became, from something that started as an idea of being a small sales center, it actually became a town hall. And that's complete from being a function of sales, it became a function of public use and public addresses. And it's now become the space for the National Science the National Science Center for the National Science Exhibition or the Edinburgh Science Exhibition every year. It also led us to looking at, how you express things. This is a diagram that we developed while we were doing the Discovery Center with a British artist called Rod Hunt. What the client will always ask you for shiny, nice, pretty renders of what your project is going to be. But the project's actually an evolution. The project is a narrative that has to start somewhere, and you have to work through it. So we found the right way to we felt the right way to actually express the city was through a series of cartographs or caricatures, so that a child can also imagine what living in the city is going to be like, and then start projecting that out to the future. And why we do that, we also look at how transport in a city can be. Now, if you've read, then this kind of a automated capsule module is something that's now being pushed in at the new Jewar airport, where you realize public transport has to change. Public transport has to change from carrying hundreds of people in a bus to being one or two people in a small module, because the last connection is anyway happening to a small module. As long as the large modules are automated, you're in a safe place because you're not going to have accidents. And that's the change that architecture requires, right? So as the language of architecture and the beams at the beginning and the end of architecture has changed through time. And that includes how our places of worship have to be. That's a project we did in the studio a couple of years ago, and it's one set on a 300-acre piece of land for a temple in Karnataka. And it's interesting that you go from being a completely technically driven studio, slapping together glass and steel projects, experimenting with plastic, realizing that people actually need places of worship because they need to believe that there is someone else controlling their future, and they want this hope that there's a better future at the end. And the communication of that emotion cannot happen through just layers of technical drawing. You actually have to go into a visualization exercise. And when you visualize it, you have to start putting in enough expression and enough sort of enough layers of soul in just your renderings. The render or the communication of your work isn't just technical. It's not just about layers of environmental discipline or layers of social discipline. It actually becomes an emotive exercise. And while through architecture discipline work, what we realize while we dabble in work such as this with local material and so on and so forth, it's possible to do when you're outside the metropolis, when you're working in a state which is not urban. But the moment you walk into a really intense cosmopolitan space, you have to know, well, the expression of your work has to change to something that is leaner, more contemporary, less crisper. And that's the dialogue that exists within the studio itself. Now, when you do this, the studio in itself is enriching its own language and its own tools and its own repertoire, because you're learning cross disciplines. You're learning from a project in Ranakpur, and you're learning from a project in an urban center like Gurgaon. But then COVID hit, and we realized that the model for our city is actually failing, and we needed a better approach for architecture. So we found with a client a piece of land. This is a 32-acre project by a river, which had been completely destroyed due to monoculture and monoculture farming. And what we've done here is we started what is India's first biological community, or what you call a biosphere, where we replanted. So the land was actually completely destroyed and desolate. We were told that the land can never be used, it will never be fertile. And it was absolutely grey and barren. And after 1 year of plantation, what we see are new varieties and new species of plants, and now even butterflies in this space. what we expect to do with this project is to actually populate what we're going to call a biosphere, have space for 30 odd residents in this in a place which is next to well, which is at the moment a seasonal river, but we expect to make it a perennial water body. And then this space actually becomes a space of a township that people and animals go habit, and we've actually sort of intend to recover 30 or 40 odd acres of soil and land. And the first part that settlement is actually now under construction. We intend to see it, with the intent being that we create a new paradigm for townships that allow us to change the pattern of consumption that we've all learned from all these years of doing what we do. And we've also started looking, and like I said, as been a product design studio, we're also looking to explore things like health bands and bands that actually tell you when you're about to fall sick, what's actually happening to you. So where the functionality is way beyond that of wearing a ring or a watch, it actually starts communicating with people around to say, listen, this person has this, then you may as well, this you might need to stay away. And a lot of these actually led us to uh, present our work in places like the London Design Biennale and Lisbon Design Biennale as templates to what actually happens. Now, next level to this again is that your projects, whatever you may do, be it small or large, cannot be divorced from a critical engagement. And the critical engagement, be it, I don't know where the slide is here, uh, has to focus on creating habitat. And habitat is not just your place of living. I think that one for animals, but habitat for people to work and to relax in. And to find a real architectural expression, you have to be able to put together an ideology with the poetry and express it through technical layers. And that's really what was our first project, where we used reclaimed material from the site, and it's a 50-room hotel on a 7-acre piece of land, where we used reclaimed material from the site to actually build and create a building that was completely passively cooled and had 100% regeneration air conditioning system, where we won a few awards for energy efficiency in by the Emerson organization. The expression of a process is what we are trying to say through architecture, which is what the Runapur project is about. How you layer it, how you take air out of a building, how you bring light into a building. Why does this talking about the processes of air, light, and construction give you a meaning and create a series of processes that you can future refer in your work? And it's the same layer that you use for projects such as an architectural one or a national campaign, which is the Make in India program. These are some images of how this project came together when in 2015, Narendra Modi had become the Prime Minister for the first time, where he announced a national program and it became this, which is the Make in India project, which went on to become a Make in India center. And it's you see the lion as an icon, and it's now something that's sort of referenced and put out. It tells you how, or it taught us how a studio that starts as small as ours, doing a small resort project in one small village in Rajasthan, can actually start doing a national outreach campaign. This is all the city of Hanover in 2015 for 6 months, where all you would see is the line in India. So we actually went from India all the way to Hanover, start talking about what the the national program, the national philosophy for production, for architecture, and for progressive growth has to be. And again, the learning in that project was, can architecture capture the spirit of people? And when you create an icon that that's not just connected with your population, but it's something for your people, but also one that people across the world start enjoying. You realize that architecture does have that power, and that's what creates inspiration, and that's what starts becoming the harbinger of change. We've also been doing regenerative work. So, this is a small step where I think a lot of people know about this temple, and it's a temple that's actually a dumping ground in the city of Jodhpur, where we pumped in a little bit of our own money. It wasn't much, but you realize that even as a professional practice, you can make money, you can spare capital, and you can actually push that in for Karyashala project to become a regenerative reservoir for the city of Jodhpur. The interesting story about the city of Jodhpur, by the way, is it was never a blue city. The blue came from a Coca-Cola advertisement that was done by a guy called Tarsen Singh. He actually handed out buckets of paint and said, "We'll give you free paint, but the only paint we have available is blue." So everybody wanted to paint the house for free. And he made it a blue city because the blue contrasts very well with the color red when he was actually filming that. It was in 1997. Uh, so it's sometimes it's large intervention, sometimes it's small intervention. But essentially, architecture has to be regenerative. And architecture has to be intense. And it's that intensity, that sort of back and forth, that commitment over years and years and years of continue, that requires continuity, that actually builds the practice and presents you with a position. I think what happens often nowadays is that we see people in magazines, we see small projects getting covered, and you realize that that's all it takes. It takes one project, it takes two projects, and maybe it takes a little bit of communication skill, and maybe it takes a little bit of PR and some social media. But that's really not what it is. There's a lot of hard work in architecture, and there's a lot of communication and a lot of ownership that one has to take, and a lot of risk that one has to take. We have to put it out and actually have a diverse portfolio that can result in architecture that's a little more meaningful and that contributes to people living in a city. Uh, it's when you create these layers that you have the freedom to walk in to say a government office like we did a little after COVID, and we said, look, while we're designing for the wealthiest, it enabled us to actually learn our skills. They've enabled us to learn and experiment with new material, new techniques. But they don't really need us. They want us to do a few things for them. What we uh, what we need to do is actually give back. So part of our doing that was a project that we did as a theoretical one for that was based on some requirements for the Indian Army. That then went on to become a medical facility. It was showcased in London, and finally became the Mohalla clinics, which are now the copyright of ours that we gave out to the Delhi government. We actually open sourced it a bit like Elon Musk, they open sourced the Tesla copyrights. And the Mohalla clinics are now being repeated in India and in Punjab, well, in Delhi, Punjab, I believe now in Haryana, and in few places in Nepal now. And it was all put together in about 3 weeks' time by a series of craftsmen or metal workers and carpenters that we had groomed over the last 20 years. I'm not going to talk about this. It's a recent project and it works with mass timber. And I think we can move on to the end of the objective being that through small gestures and large gestures, architecture has to engage with new techniques, new materials, express its processes to create regenerative environments and to create something which is exciting, which is a new form, so that people can live better life and through an exchange in policy have better use of land. This is one of our largest projects in the center of Delhi. It's a residential estate, which is the largest residential estate in Delhi at the moment. And I'm going to skip to that as well. It just explains there's actually a pattern mover study that we did to create sun breakers for a building using thermocouples, where they tend to move themselves based on how much heat is falling on them. So they close when there's too much heat and they start opening out when when the heat sort of relaxes, to become a building which has a dynamic facade. And someone here is showing a dynamic facade. So that's not really a dynamic facade. I mean, that's only a visual dynamic. Here, it's not just a dynamic visual, it's also a technical layer. It sort of opens out these louvers, these very, very large louvers, so they can become, uh, so they become part of these architectural expression of a very large project. And of course, regeneration. I'm going to get to this as well. But essentially, if you're not going to deal with conservation, you're not going to be effective in architecture. And if you don't put in the hours and well, the years, days, and hours of blood, sweat, and tears, you're not going to improve your skill level, and you'll sort of be divorcing yourself from technical and creative understanding. And that's a few more of our regenerative work that where we look at buildings that are extensions of preservation projects or sort of adaptive reuse projects with extension to a new to new with extensions to new buildings where even the connection between two areas actually becomes a place for people to well, at the end of the day, architecture has to create an ambiance. It's not about creating this technically neutral shells. And I think that's the challenge that we face in modern architecture today. Is that you and is that we're often doing work which is a little too shallow and a little too repetitive each time round. Any questions? That's it. I'm done.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the insightful conversation, Lauren. I just wanted to ask, how do you manage to make the form of your building speak for itself? How does it speak for the concept it goes with it?
Well, look, architecture is actually abstract. But if you engage, if you look at your project through critical activity, right, understand what a project really needs to be, you will find some layers, be it through color, or some clues, be it through color or form or technique, that make that sort of help you find the right expression for the project. More often than not, what we are looking for is clarity. And if you find that clarity, and that clarity usually comes through, going over a piece of paper with a pencil or a sketch pen over and over again, and finally drawing it up and then redoing it, scrapping it, and redoing it again. Right? So, because the hand to mind connection is is one that actually really lends itself well to critical thinking. So, sort of meditate over your project while you're actually drawing. And I think the challenge is find when you're working on multiple projects to find the ability to make a studio do that. Because you will not be in the right frame of mind every day. Not everyone in the studio will be in the right frame of mind every day. You will not be, it's like an individual or a sports person who's not always informed, and similarly a team that's not always informed. And it's about finding that rigor, and that's when you start certain processes, right? Be it construction related or form finding related or meaning related. I think if you build on a philosophy of work, which doesn't always have to be written and spoken, right? A lot of what we say as practices is actually post-rationalization. Where you've done it, you've learned it from others over the years. You found a few people who you idolize, and you found a few people who you'd like to emulate. You start you start learning from that thread, and you start adding your own layers to it just because you can't actually do it as well as they've done. So don't get it done for 40, 50 years before you have. you will find that to a certain level of intensity and to a certain level of externalizing the processes, you will be able to start creating meaning to architecture and a connection. But remember, that connection is abstract. That connection is abstract, and it's a working connection that happens when there is a particular function. If I look at a discovery center, it could be anything. Right? It doesn't have to be a town hall. When you realize it's a town hall, you find that it's appropriate for a town hall. But so can a delivery college be a town hall. It may not be as appropriate a town hall. So I think expression and appropriateness of architecture is a forever quest. And that's the one thing that you have to spend a lot of time honing your skills on. Because you'll only really get 3 to 4% of your time on a project to do that, right? It's the first step of your project. After which, you're going to spend 95% of your time making technical drawing. Your learning there has to be how you enhance that diagram, how you enhance your first step, not how you dilute. And I think if you don't know your technique well enough, you'll struggle. And then often you'll say, oh, well, I was trying to do this, but I couldn't do it, so I did this. And that's not a tenable answer in the world, right? You'll say, I'm trying to get here. If you're convinced about where you're trying to get, you just keep trying to get.